to serve and protect Black women, expanding our understanding of safety as the status quo shifts. My name is Megan Simmons, and I am a senior policy attorney with Ujima Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. Again, thank you so much for joining our presentation. Just to share a little bit about Ujima, we're a culturally specific organization, and we center our advocacy work, technical assistance, and the like on community violence, domestic violence, and sexual violence. Again, hoping that you are going to enjoy our presentation. Today, we have a lively bunch that have a wealth of information and knowledge and experiences. They're all practitioners in their own right. And so I can't wait to hear some of the responses to some of the questions. But before we start, I just want to give a little bit of a summary about what about the presentation, as well as making it clear that this is the first part of a two-part presentation. The next part of the presentation will be next week, and we'll have an entirely new panel with different questions. So in summary, this two-part webinar will explore what it means to serve and protect Black women. The first part of the webinar will ground us in the language of police reform. Panelists will articulate differences between the various police reform ideology to include defund, abolish, reform, and dismantle, and the potential outcomes for Black women survivors. Panelists will set the stage for part two next week by also delving into the potential impacts of police reform that police reform can have for not only the survivor community, but the community at large. The second part of the webinar brings together a small group of community-based and domestic violence service providers for a round-robin style conversation on the role that Black leadership will play in supporting survivors' safety in policies as policies shift and change. Again, we are so happy that you have decided to spend some time with us and share space with us today. We look forward to seeing you next week. I'm going to introduce our panelists and read a little bit more about them. Once they jump in and start answering questions, they may share a little bit more about themselves should they decide. That said, I'm just going to give you some brief information about them before we get started. For our domestic violence perspective, we have Ms. Lisa Lynn Jacobs, is just the CEO of Just Solutions. Lisa R. Jacobs is the CEO of Just Solutions, bringing in justice to counteract injustice, and the former VP for 13 years of government relations for Legal Momentum, formerly now Legal Defense and Education Fund. She advises clients on a variety of issues, including campus sexual assault, workplace and other economic protections for victims in domestic and sexual violence, as well as stalking, racial equity, criminal justice, policing reform, and the intersection of the two of more of these issues. She's the recipient of the American Bar. She's been the recipient of the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence 2020 Vision Award in 15, has contributed to Michelle Obama's impact on African-American women and girls, the author of Workplace Discrimination and Termination of Survivors' Rights and Options, and Guide on Consumer and Economic, Civil, Legal, and Advocacy for Survivors. Welcome, Lisa. Next, we have Sergeant Carol Adams of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. Sergeant Adams, or Carol D. Adams, has worked in law enforcement for 31 years. She started her career with the Richmond Sheriff's Department, where she served 7 years prior to joining the Richmond, Virginia Police Department, where she has worked for 24 years. In that capacity, she served in the Community Care Sergeant for the Community Youth Interventions Services Division, where she is responsible for establishing and maintaining community partnerships, crime prevention, and crime prevention education. She now serves in the special project centered around community problem solving, focusing on engagement initiatives. Sergeant Adams has received appointments to the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services Board and the Department of Justice Advisory Board. She's worked closely with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Executive Research Forum, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the Office of Violence Against Women, Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, the Department of Justice, and Federal Law Enforcement, and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Welcome, Sergeant Adams. And Mr. Mighty Fine, who will be providing our community health perspective. Mighty Fine is the director of the Center of Public Health Practice and Professional Development at the American Public Health Association. His portfolio focuses on enhancing health science, policy, public health practice, and public health leadership. Trained as a social epidemiologist, his work has stemmed across various aspects of public health, including injury and violence prevention, maternal and family health, HIV/AIDS, HCV, social policy, and chronic disease prevention. Having lived and worked in rural and urban environments, Mighty credits his empirical insight with anchoring his understanding of systemic levers of oppression. Thus, a core part of his work has focused on addressing the structures that serve as pillars of disadvantage. He has built an expertise in the social determinants of health and brings a social justice perspective to the assessment and prevention of public health issues. Welcome, Mighty Fine. Thanks so much. All right, folks, just a few housekeeping items. In the event that you have some specific questions, please shoot them to the Q&A box. If you'd like to chime in or share your thoughts, feel free to pop that into our chat box. We love to have lively discussion amongst the individuals that decide that they're going to participate and share different things as the panelists are speaking. Also, feel free to go ahead and introduce yourselves. Let us know where you are joining us from, and anything else that you might want to share with us. We're going to go ahead and transition into our questions. Let's start with the first one. Lisa Lynn, what are some of the barriers that Black women may experience, during police interaction?
Thanks, Megan, and thank you to Ujima for hosting this important discussion and for having me on. I think the most important thing to talk about when we're talking about barriers is how we show up, or how we are perceived to show up. And by that, I mean the following. Last week, I was in Oklahoma City, and I did a number of things, but I was on a panel with law enforcement, and I was in a room full of prosecutors, judges, service providers, and again, law enforcement, right? In responding to a question, I literally said the following, right? As Black women, we are not perceived to have a right of self-defense, right? No one contradicted me. Not the judge sitting in the front row, not the former police chief or the police captain sitting with me on the dais, not anyone in the room, right? So when you proceed from that basis, you understand that when Black women are having an encounter with law enforcement, they're already proceeding from a deficit posture, right? That if, I think many of us might have been following the Gabby Petito case in the paper and realized that law enforcement there literally and nearly mistook this woman who was a victim of domestic violence, almost labeled her as being the primary aggressor, right? So you then shift that lens to a Black woman who is not perceived to have a right of self-defense. If law enforcement is called to a scene of intimate partner violence, and there is any indication of a struggle, that increases the likelihood that a Black woman is either going to be perceived as the primary aggressor or as one of the two aggressors, and that in either of those instances, she is as likely as her partner, whether or not her partner is the harm doer, she is as likely to be arrested or detained or treated, met immediately on scene with suspicion and all the the harm and the threat and the discomfort that that implies, even when it is she who has reached out to law enforcement for help.
Okay. Mighty, can you speak to how health and wellness have been impacted within the Black community as a result of police and systems violence?
Sure. I'd like to, again, thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and I'm pleased to be sharing space with the co-panelists and you, Megan, as the facilitator. So what I would say is that public health, we know that violence broadly is a major issue, namely because it's a leading cause of premature death or a leading cause of an unnatural cause of death. So we know that's clearly an issue, particularly among us in the African American community. We also know that interactions with law enforcement more so obviously lead to death and injury. And in public health, I wouldn't be a true public health professional without using a metaphor. And so we like to use the iceberg analogy, right? Where that's just the tip of the iceberg. So we hear about the numbers and we learn about the deaths or those interactions, but what's underneath is all of the deleterious mental health and emotional impacts of that, whether it's witnessing violence, being a victim and survivor of police-initiated violence. And we recognize that that has immediate and certainly long-term impacts, not just for the individual, but the neighborhood, the family, and extended beyond that. An example that has been elevated most recently is the witnessing of Black people being killed. Folks are filming it and we're watching it and thinking about the secondary and tertiary trauma that's causing collectively as the Black community, even thinking about the young children who are exposed to that. And recent studies have shown that exposure to particularly unarmed Black people being killed by police, it's shown that kids are have emotional reactions to that in school. They're not going to school. Their performance is diminished. And to me, that's inextricably linked to this school to prison pipeline, right? Because if the kids act out in school, then that's a higher likelihood that they'll have interaction with the school resource officer, or, so it's a compounded problem. And I guess to punctuate my statement is mostly saying that we have to think about both the physical injuries, but also the mental injuries and again, the immediate and long-term impacts that they have for us individually as Black people, and certainly collectively as a community.
Thank you so much, Mighty. Sergeant Adams, so you're bringing a wealth of knowledge as it relates to law enforcement. We'd like to get your perspective on this question. Can you talk to us about the unique challenges that Black law enforcement experience and their role in community policing?
Okay. Well, some of the challenges we know are derivatives of the historical police-community relationships locally and nationally, and especially with technology. So every incident is very readily available to everyone. And so as humans, when we see individuals who look like us in any situations, there's an automatic assumption of connectedness and understanding and leniency. And whereas sometimes that might not be the case, you might see an officer that looks like you, but they may not be that friendly, that kind, that caring, that empathetic person that you would desire them to be. So some of the terms, and especially last summer with all of the unrest, as standing on the front lines and standing on the lines myself, you're being called the snitch, you're being called the sellout, and you've been, all of these other terms. Lack of competence, ethics, and empathy, all of the things, but that's because the actions of others in our profession. That's what we deal with every day. But the goal is to work hard so that you can change that narrative, so that you can create and you can show that, and that's by working throughout the years in your community, being consistent, and being there and being that listening ear, and being able to see them and to hear them. There's nothing more important than when you respond to a call is to see the person and to hear the person and to afford them the opportunity, no matter what the circumstance or situation is to be heard, and to acknowledge their pain, to acknowledge their trauma, and to be able to support and to assist them. So it's about your oath. It's being dedicated to serve all individuals like you would want to be served. And that's how I approach my everyday as being an officer, that I always want to treat people like I want to be treated. But as African-American officers, we're more than likely very often judged according to the actions of our counterparts or what they've seen. It does not matter color. It's more directed to the uniform, to the profession itself.
Oh, guess I need to unmute myself before I start following up on questions. Thank you all for the hand signs. Sergeant Adams, thank you for sharing that. And just one follow-up question. Is there anything unique about being a woman, a Black woman in particular, in law enforcement?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's the best role. And if we're paying attention, there are not women, women are not shooting and hurting people. Women are out there and we are getting it done. And we're supposed to be the lesser, strength-wise when it comes down to it in the relationship. And when you're out there and you're working, we're natural nurturers, right? We are gonna see you for who you are, whether you're our child, our sister, our mother, our auntie. And that's what gives you that extra bonus, that added bonus of, of being able to help people calm down and to have that listening ear and to help them process through any situation. So yes, that's a bonus being a female, and it's really, really wonderful that someone woke up one day and decided that it was okay because I'm 5'5" and I weigh 99 pounds, that I would have never, and I'm a Black woman, I would have never, ever been afforded the opportunity to do this job. And I tell you, I would trade it for nothing in this world. I have the best job in the whole wide world because when I wake up every day, I know I'm going to have a significant positive impact on someone, some way, shape, or form by the end of my 8 hours or my 12 hours, whichever it is that I'm whatever tour I'm performing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that perspective. Lisa Lynn, what would police reform mean policy-wise? And have certain calls for action received more attention or interest than others?
Sure. If I may, I'd also like to follow up on a couple of things that Sergeant Adams just shared about
Please do. Yep.
Women in policing, right? She has the options and the access that she has because folks from the time period of Pauli Murray and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and others fought for women to be able to do this work, recognized because of their abilities and their skills, right? Not the perceptions. Part of what we are talking about in this context is what happens vis-a-vis the perceptions. But particularly with respect to women in policing, the data tells us that women have as law enforcement, have a much lower instance of charges and allegations of excessive force, right? Use of excessive force. The data also tells us that that is because women have a much higher tolerance for defiance and disrespect, right? So the first time I ever heard that, I was like, you mean it's because we're moms, right? We have to deal with teenagers all the time, and that can make women, right, much more, you have a longer fuse. That's really what I was trying to get to in that space. But with respect to criminal justice reform, I think that many of us have been following what is going on Capitol Hill with respect to the George Floyd policing bill, right? It was like many things passed very early in the Congress out of the House of Representatives and then went to the Senate where it has been awaiting action, right? And Senator Booker and others have been leading these discussions on both sides of the House, trying to move the bill forward, trying to find a way forward. I have to say that I am a little disheartened today because just this morning comes the news that that team of folks who has been having that conversation back and forth across the Senate and the House feel like they've hit a wall, right? Feel like they, at least at this moment, I'm guessing they're gonna press pause because they are struggling to find a way forward around the issue of qualified immunity, right? Qualified immunity is what makes an individual law enforcement officer not liable not legally responsible for charges of excessive force or, improper conduct when motorists or others that they encounter are harmed, right? A law enforcement entity like a police department can be held liable, right? But because of the existence of qualified immunity, you cannot sue an individual law enforcement officer for the harm he or she causes in an encounter, even if, as Sergeant Adams suggests, in the modern era, much is available to us in the way of video, right? Although I will say, and Sergeant Adams knows this as well, right? We both live in the great state of Virginia, right? And there's actually a fair amount of protection and barriers when it comes to actually being able to access that footage, right? It's not available as of right, even if you have been harmed or even if you were the person filmed in that context. But the question then is, where we are going to go in this context of police reform and police accountability, right? I think that some of the other things that were also included in the George Floyd bill were bans on chokeholds, among other things. And were also more money for training and presumably screening for law enforcement. As I think all of us know, the president is very reform-minded, right? I think there's a spectrum of people when you talk about the approach to where we are in policing these days. There is the abolish the police universe, right? There is the defund universe, and then there's the reform universe. Our president is very much in the reform universe. So I think that many of the things that were in the George Floyd bill sit in that particular space, right? I think additional funding also for the community-oriented policing or COPS program at the Department of Justice, so that they can continue to do the engaging, the reforming, the encouraging of community policing that they do, right? I think that there are local jurisdictions that have also been taking this on, and so there continues to be hope for and progress to be had in that space. But I think we are sitting with a question just today about how and whether there can be prospects for making progress in the federal space, especially since we have 3 full months left in 2021 and a midterm election next year, which means that progress, particularly at the federal level, is going to be that much more difficult to come by. So it will be interesting to see how, whether, and where we can go forward.
Thank you so much. Sergeant Adams, what types of simple shifts in practice or understanding would assist non-Black law enforcement in working with Black communities and Black survivors? And what's the role of Black leadership in communicating the needs and realities of the Black community?
Well, education, of course, is the priority, is that you have to become educated. You need to spend time in the communities, get to know individuals and see them for who they are, and learn the history of the communities, not just what you've seen on social media, you've seen in the movies. You cannot relate to people. Come in with that, we have a lot of preconceived notions as to who people are because of where they live, where the violent crime is and stuff like that. So the goal is to be able to spend time with them and to expose yourself. It's about being culturally diverse. And that's an advantage that this new generation, this younger generation has over some of us that was born in the 60s, where we were, raised isolated. So that's going to help with the complexities of public safety as it is now, because public safety is going to be a lot more diverse, and those younger individuals are not going to stand, as we saw this summer. They're going to stand together, and they're going to stand for what's right and what's best for the entire community. And so that's going to be a number one priority. That's going to help us move forward in the profession. But not just learning, but being exposed and having those experiences and going out requirements for the recruits to go out and to spend time in the community before they actually graduate and go out and to become police officers, so that they can see those individuals for the humans that they are, and that, you know, and not being compared to what they believe or what they think, because, you know, people can become jaded. We all can, and we can all have assumptions about people, but to be able to dig in and get started right up front. And on the leadership, you know, that's the key, is the message has to come from the top to the bottom, and it has to be demonstrated. It cannot just be talked about, but the entire staffing, all levels of policing has to demonstrate the importance of it, just for not just the African-American communities, but for all communities. We have to be equal with our customer service. We have to be equally involved, and we have to stand with them. And so I call it equity in resources, equity in responses, and equity in responsibility when we talk about, you know, public safety and providing the services. Because when people call, they want a knight in shiny armor. They don't want their worst nightmare. They want someone who's going to have that listening ear, who's going to acknowledge them. And it has to be demonstrated. It's just like policing is just like being a parent. You can't tell your child one thing and then exhibit a different behavior or language, because those children are going to pick that up. So it's really, really important that, you know, that there is a shift in the training. So you're not just taught the laws about in your community, but you also get out to spend time, and you've been educated on the historical context of your state, whichever one it may be. And me being here in Virginia, you know, that's a delicacy right there. So there's so many different dynamics. And so the true history needs to be shared, so that there's a clear understanding, not a perception, but a clear understanding.
Yeah, and just to pick up what Sergeant Adams is putting down, I think, as she alluded to, having the community voice elevated as we're thinking about those interactions are clearly important. And also ensuring that we're coming to the table, just not law enforcement, but public health, community partners, and really reestablishing this ideal of shared safety. So to your point, there's some people who see police officers and they feel safe, right? There's some who see police and they may, it may elicit fear in some instances. So again, redefining and reshaping what that shared safety narrative means for folks involved, not just law enforcement, but also the communities that they're serving.
Right. And to piggyback off of that, you know, when policing was established, when you go back to Peel, Sir Robert Peel, the principles, it says the people are the police and the police are the people. So it's a togetherness. And then we went through these different stints of, you know, being the political era and then community policing era. So there became a divide, because then police were directed towards certain communities and not towards others to police, you know. And so that's what we have to come back to, you know. So when I talk about the history, the historical context, but the history of policing as well, you know, because we've turned a curve and turned the blind eyes that, you know, we are all the police, and we are all responsible for making sure that our communities are safe. And so it has to be a joint effort, and it's not one voice over the other. And it's a we have to come together. So it's a power with, not a power over.
An interesting perspective. I've actually never kind of heard it laid out like that. Thanks so much for sharing that. This question is for all of the panelists. Why may it be difficult for folks to consider police reform, even if our current system is failing many Black women specifically and costing millions each year? We could start with Lisa Lynn.
Sure, can you hear me?
We certainly can.
Okay, thank you. So the answers are both complicated and simple, right? It may be that the system is costing millions. However, the system is responding as it was intended, right? We are having a reform-minded discussion. We are trying from a standpoint of equity and otherwise to understand why the system does not work for Black women. We have to proceed from the threshold understanding that the system was not meant to be responsive to Black women, right? And that policing, you know, emerged from state and local level slave catching, right? And that the system has always had a bias and a view about how people of color showed up in the system and what was supposed to happen as a result, right? So that our prospects for reform are, largely, there is a lot of prospect for progress in some spaces, right? But only in spaces where everyone is around the table and acknowledging what happens in cases like what happened with George Floyd, right? Um, I sort of hearken to the comments of the comedian who said, we spend a lot of time talking about bad apples, right? We don't talk about bad apples when we are talking about flying airplanes, right? We have standards, we demand them, we expect enforcement, right? So I think we have to move to a place of acknowledging policing as something that needs to be about a community good, but redefining our sense of community more inclusively so that we acknowledge that policing is supposed to be responsive to everyone in a community as opposed to a smaller universe of folks, which is the reality for so many people right now.
Sorry. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in? And I'll repeat the question just in case. Why may it be difficult for folks to consider police reform, even if our current system is failing many Black women specifically and costing millions each year?
I would say one thing is just sort of to Lisa Lynn's response. It's what people know and what they're accustomed to, right? This is how they're accustomed to policing working. And we recognize that it's a very nuanced and complex system and issue. And so there's not a singular solution to it, right? To I think Lisa Lynn's point, some people are saying abolish, some are reforming, some are reimagining. So I think the complexity of it makes the question a little bit more loaded. And so it takes us to take a step back to think about, to Sergeant Adams' perspective, well, what is the initial intention of policing, right? And is it meeting that demand? And we've seen some police departments, they've brought on social workers and other community health workers and other folks within the community to help triage some of those things that police are being called for. And I mean this with the utmost respect. They, some things that they're being asked to do, they maybe haven't been trained to do, they're not qualified to do per se. So it's really about reestablishing and re-anchoring what is the true intention of policing. Does that need to be redefined or reevaluated? And ensuring that the needs that people are elevating to police are adequately being addressed either by police or some other institutions, and redirecting that purposefully.
Thank you.
And so as we talk about this system is antiquated. This system is outdated. This system is serving the purpose that for which it was created for. So until we create a new system, and that is the work at hand, is to create a new system so that we can have different outcomes. We have witnessed the outcomes of the system that we have right now. So it is doing its intended purpose. And so the goal is for us to have to design this new system and this system is not working on behalf of the people that we're talking about. And so it is doing exactly what it was purposed to do, funnel them into these different situations. And as my defined as saying that policing, when you dial 911, you dial 911 if your cat's stuck in the tree, you dial 911 if your kid won't go to school, you dial 911 if somebody's parked in your parking space, and you dial 911. Policing has come to a one-stop stop place, right? One shop place. Everything goes right into there. And we can't say no. When we get a 911 call and that call comes to me, I have to go and I have to take that call. And so, and I have to have the wherewithal and to be professional enough to be able to tackle it with the resources that I have, the knowledge that I have, the expertise, the experience that I have. And it's all based on my life experiences as to how in the training that I've had. But 24 years, I've had a lot of training, and I'm, one of those kids from a community where, my dad murdered my mom when I was 17 years old. So my stance and from my lens is totally different from some 25-year-old kid that came from out west, out Nevada, who has not had any life experiences. And so what do they do with that? And so that's what we really, really have to look at. You know, this system that we talked about is antiquated. We need a new system in place so that we can dictate and we can facilitate as to what the expectations of the outcomes are, so that we can have better outcomes and better expectations, and that the system will work for everyone that calls and work in the manner that it's supposed to be. And so that's what we really, really have to dig into, because the expected outcomes, they're not going to be different, because we're still trying to drive. And I've said this before, the first car Ford made, the first engine Ford ever put together, that's gone. And we're still trying to operate in our criminal justice system with that first system, so that the work is ahead of us to recreate that system, redesign that system, so that we can have different and better outcomes for individuals. Because we know when we look at domestic violence, it takes 7 times before that victim's gonna possibly call for help to come. And then if the help comes and it's not the right person, the right attitude, they're gonna suffer. They're going to continue to be traumatized. Their kids are going to be traumatized. And so in the person responding, if they've never had any experience, they're going to be straight the facts. Just give me the facts. And if the person is talking about what happened 6 months ago, that officer is going to be short-winded. It's like, well, no, tell me what happened right now. So they're going to miss all of that information that that person is trying to share with them. That's going to be very critical to the outcome of this call. So there are some things that, you know, we do need to work on, but that's the key, is that this system, we know that when we talk about reform, that we have to build a new car. We have to build a new system.
Yeah, just yes, I don't know if I was smiling outwardly, but internally I certainly was, because I think hearing that perspective from a respected person in law enforcement, I think it really resonates with me, because I'm from the school of thought that I don't think reform is where we need to go, but even though it's overused, it's a reimagining, because we elevated on this call thus far the true intentions of policing. We know that's not serving us, right? And when we think about the sort of the systemic components of it. So I totally agree. It's not about retrofitting within the system that's existing. It's about really truly reimagining and rededicating and reallocating the way we envision safety in this country, which certainly isn't connected to criminal justice reform more broadly. And it's connected to mass incarceration, who's being charged for what, how our neighborhoods are designed, so it increases our interaction with police. So yeah, again, not to go on a whole diatribe, but I'm from the school of thought that we need to reimagine, reestablish, and not necessarily reform the current system that we have now.
Thanks so much. Folks, we're going to move on to another question. How are we prioritizing Black trans women and their experiences with law enforcement? Anyone can jump in.
I'll just start, kick us off. Oh, were you going to say something, Lisa? Then go for it. I saw you were going to unmute.
Thanks, Mighty. I think the answer is probably someplace between either not well or we're not, right? A lot of the work that I do in the movement comes from a standpoint of racial and economic equity, right? You have to focus on the needs of the people who are facing the greatest challenges in the system, because if you can successfully respond to them where they are and improve access for them, you will by definition have improved access for everyone else, right? It's that canary in the coal mine analogy, right? If you improve access for the canary, which is the most vulnerable creature, you will have improved everyone else's access in that effort. And I think that all of us doing this work acknowledge that trans women are at greatest risk, are most vulnerable, and are simultaneously not being served by a system that may and is in all likelihood is over policing them at the same time, right? They're being criminalized, right? And so I think that in places where there is a strong LGBT community or advocacy element, folks who are engaged with law enforcement and the community doing two things, right? Demanding accountability from law enforcement, but also trying to figure out how the community can be engaged in supporting and protecting the trans community, right, as valued members. Where both of those things have happened, I think there's room for improvement. I think that we're in a better position, right? That's actually the way to go forward. But I think it is just so, so much of what goes on in this country is situational, right? I just talked about two things that we need, right? First, you need to have law enforcement that is engaged and interested in being responsive and accountable and being at the table, which is not always a thing, right? Second, you need to have a strong community and advocacy element that is there standing in the gap for community who are vulnerable, right? And depending on where you are, whether or not that's a rural place or, a city or, in the suburbs, et cetera, the strength of the ability of community to hold space for and advocate for a vulnerable community is really, that's going to determine in significant measure the progress that one is able to make in that space.
Mighty, I think you were going to jump in.
Sergeant Adams is, I'll let her go.
Oh, my apologies. I didn't see you, Sergeant
It's
Adams.
okay. That is okay. That is okay. But it goes back to our underserved population, our under-resourced populations. The entities where the resources are needed, there's a lack of. But I can say here where I am, the work is consistent in the relationships and the partnerships. And so bringing people together and allowing people to be seen and to be heard. And sometimes I run into when I go to meetings with the LGBT community, those that are at the table are, they're great with us or with me, but then it's their communication at large. So we run into this dual situation here. You have those who are at the table and willing to work alongside police, but then there are others who are worried about the stigma of working with the police. And that's not just with the LGBT community, but that's with any community that, because people have different views and different experiences when it comes down to working with law enforcement. So the work is going to be tough, but it's a long journey, but we've made a lot more strides compared to where we have come from, and just continuing to try to continue to build the relationships so that we can make sure that it's equitable in access and resources for everyone that we serve in our communities.
And I'll just add quickly to that. I agree with what both remarks thus far. And again, I'll just add that it speaks to the global issue regarding transgender health, particularly for Black trans women and their, when we think about the violence that they're experiencing, we are seeing that now a little bit more in the news where they're talking about who gets coverage and whose lives are valued and which ones are devalued by just absence from media coverage or interest. So I think that's certainly reflected within the Black trans community, because I would not say it is a priority, but certainly something that needs to be prioritized, not just interactions with law enforcement, but globally to what has been already elevated when we think about our under-resourced and underserved population. They certainly are within that framework.
And I was on mute again, forgive me. Mighty, you started to get into it, but could you give an example of maybe what you envision public health for Black communities could begin to look like if we weren't dealing with major stresses like police violence and system inequities?
They'd be thriving and, build, right? We've seen sort of an intentional disinvestment in the declination of communities of color, particularly communities that are concentrated with Black folks. But we know that that's by design, right? We've all learned about redlining, and we know the schools are under-resourced. We know that there are derelict buildings. We know, and pardon, no intention to generalize here, just setting the stage of sort of the social determinants of health that exacerbate violence. And that's why in public health, we look at violence as a social determinant of health, because we know perpetration and victimization, it's cyclical, and it's within the family structure, but also within the neighborhood and community. So my response to that would be, if we really address the upstream impacts to our health, so beyond sort of primary prevention, thinking of like primordial prevention and thinking about neighborhood design, thinking about employment, thinking about true investment in resourcing communities based on their need, I think we would see communities that are existing today. So it's not an anomaly, right? We've seen it before. We've heard about like the Tulsa massacre and these thriving Black communities that were taken away from us in one way or another. So it's not as if it's impossible or that we as Black people have a proclivity for violence, right? We recognize that it's the neighborhood conditions and the social and contextual environment that increase the likelihood of violence, whether we're talking about, again, victimization or perpetration. So again, because of those sort of that concentrated disadvantage, it, again, to what I was saying before, it increases police interaction with Black people, and certainly not in a positive manner. So that's leading to all types of deleterious outcomes. So I would just say that if we address, again, these social conditions, the unnatural conditions in neighborhoods, again, that are orchestrated by design in one way or another, then we would see thriving communities, irrespective of interaction with police.
Thank you. Lisa and Carol, can we get your feedback as it relates to any standards or best practices around culturally specific and responsive training for law enforcement officers?
Well, training is key, but we have to know who that officer, who that person is as well, you know, and what they're bringing to the table with them, because we can all be taught certain things, but that doesn't mean that that's the practice. Because as parents, we know that we teach our children to be one way, and when they leave home, they could, you know, they learn a whole lot of other things and they could do different things. So that's one of the components that really has to be examined a little bit closer. You know, who are you as an individual, and what are you ready for this? Is this something that you can do? Can you allow yourself to be a professional and not to allow your personal feelings about certain groups of people override your interaction with them, or redirect your you know, the services that you provide for them? So that's really at the root of it. You know, training, everybody, we all sit in training classes and we learn certain things, but you know, how much of it can we absorb and when it's totally against who we are at our core and at our heart, there's not a lot we can do with that. So it has to be some other components that have to be put in place when we're hiring individuals to do certain things. And that's no matter what the profession is. So we need to really examine that part of it, not just the training, because there's a lot of training out there. There's a lot of activities, a lot of, you know, when you go back, you do the background investigation, you do the psychologist and the therapist talk to you and ask you questions and stuff like that. And then there are a lot of assessments that can be taken, but it boils down to who you really are at your core and why are you interested in this work? Because when we look at being a police officer, we have the power to take away freedom and to take away life. And those should be specific people, and they should really be, you know, they have to be conscientiously aware of every action that they take when you're talking about being exposed and being put out into the community and to have interactions with individuals and to have to make a split-second decision. So it's not about the training, it is about the human being and who's coming to the table. And it's sort of like in reverse, is when you're responding to the community, the person that shows up in front of you, you know, traumatized, been victimized, and all of these things. And this person is trying to, they are there, but then there's so much more. So that to me is the key, that we have to not just talk about the training, we have to talk about who the individual is and who's showing up to the table.
I agree with everything that the sergeant just shared. Couple of resources to point to before I get into the question. The US Justice Department has put out policing guidance, both on racial bias on the one hand and on gender bias on the other. So I commend those, and also to, more generally, the materials that have come out of the office on community-oriented policing, because I think there's a lot of good work going on in those spaces. I think when we start to have this conversation, we have to be looking through the lens of bias and what those of us who do this work called, either anti-bias or de-bias training, right? Because it's not a question of how a particular officer shows up in the Black community. It is a question of how that officer has been trained on their interaction with Black people, right? Because I will tell you, living here in Northern Virginia, I have lived in communities that were disproportionately white, and I have had funky, to be colloquial, right, interactions with Black officers, right? Folks who I had reached out to law enforcement seeking help because my son wandered out of my house, literally. And I had an exchange with a Black uniformed policeman who variously told me that I was not responding as other mothers he had had interaction with had responded. And he also suggested or intimated that maybe I, didn't do a good job supervising or watching out for my son, right? This was a Black man with whom I was having this conversation, right? And clearly he was operating from some standpoint of bias, right? Because I think those of us, almost all of us on this call, are familiar with the term code switching, right? I code switched on him, right? I ripped my glasses off. I basically said to him, let me tell you something. And he knew he was in trouble at that point, right? So I say that just to say he needed to check himself on how he showed up in that situation, right? It later occurred to me that he meant when he said, I wasn't showing up like other mothers. I'm standing here in Arlington, Virginia, right? You mean I'm not showing up like a white mom, right? I'm like, well, maybe the white mom has a spouse or a partner or somebody who can be taking the lead while she is falling apart. And that's part of what I imparted to him. It's just me, right? You've got to find my child and I can have the luxury of falling apart later, right? But all of this brings us back to this question of bias, right? And what clicked on, who he thought he was dealing with when he saw a Black woman, despite the fact that I had reached out to him for help, right? So when I responded to him in that way, I think his lens changed, right? He was like, oh, I'm dealing with middle-class woman who thinks that I have behaved inappropriately, literally, because I got an apology before he left, because I think he knew that middle-class woman was going to be on the phone to his boss, and he was right, right? But, that's just, and I see that my sister, Sergeant Adams, knows what I'm talking about here, right? You have to, in your de-bias training, get law enforcement to wrestle with, so what is the expectation you have when you show up and you see a Black woman, whether she's in the Black community or not, right? And we all have biases, right? I mean, that's the funny thing about the work that I do in the equity space. I was once doing training with a colleague. I'm nearly 6 feet tall, standing flat-footed. I was doing training with a colleague who's about 5'2", right? So I had these wall-sized Post-it notes, and I was putting them on the wall at a height that was appropriate for me to engage and write on them. And she came up and she kind of looked at me like, what am I supposed to do with that, right? Right? So what is needed in this space is the kind of training that will help people to understand what their biases are about Black people, about Black community, about, their racist preconceptions, because we live in a racist society, right? Do you automatically assume that there is more criminality or that your safety is more jeopardized, etc. And once you have realized that you are having that reaction, how do you reset in that context so that you can, respond appropriately, right? How do you do what that officer knew he needed to do, which was to extend an apology to me in acknowledgement that he had gotten me wrong. So those, I think, there are specific, I think, kinds of materials that law enforcement could look to, but in just the way that we all need to check ourselves in daily life about the way we may show up with biases and preconceptions, making sure that law enforcement has access to those same materials and training, and is given the opportunity to do that reset, right? I didn't write that law enforcement gentleman off forever, but let's just say I was very clear on my expectation that he come correct in that context, and he did, to his credit.
Thanks so much. Please name 2 or 3 best practices that should be considered when drafting police reform. That's a question for all 3 of you. Like, what are your thoughts? What do you think should be considered when drafting good policy?
Well, I think more community involvement, the voice and the lens from the community, right? Because most of the time, at least we attend a lot of meetings, right? And the people at the table making the decisions are not the people that are impacted by those decisions and those policies. And a lot of times people would say, well, they need such and such, or we need to do this for them, but we need to hear from the people, because I use the analogy that I invite you over to my house and then you start moving my furniture around because you don't like the way that it is there, or you don't like that I have curtains or I don't have curtains. And so we really need to hear the voice of the people, of our young Black men, our young Black women, so that whatever is created and designed, that there is significant input, and then it's the us. And that goes back to the not that power over, but power with. So when we're creating something, we have to allow every voice to be heard and every voice to play a role in any type of reform or reimagining. And like Mighty said, and here in Richmond, we were doing reimagining public safety. So that is the key in bringing all of the voices to the table and affording them the opportunity. And then at that, not to create a communication, not to communicate on a level that's above someone, above anyone that's there, so that you can make sure that you don't lose people during the process, because we can have people come to the table as a victim of domestic violence, and there's language and terminology that, or any community member that they just don't understand it. And so they will just withdraw because they don't want people to know that they're not absorbing or they're not understanding whatever is being shared at the table. So we have to have a clear communications path and afford others and everyone to be able to play a role in it and to have that voice, and to make sure that those who feel like they don't have a voice, those of us, the others of us, have to elevate that voice and make sure that that voice is heard, in whatever it is that they desire, that these are the things that are a part of this solution or resolution for the next steps in reimagining.
I would add, oh, sorry, something
No,
else?
please, yep.
What I would add to that as well, sort of from my public health lens, it's improved surveillance and data collection, reporting, and transparency. So as you all know, in public health, we look at interventions and preventions across a continuum. So I think with improved surveillance and enriched data by race and all of those things, it will help us to think more strategically how we continue to build and improve how we encourage and not enforce, but how we elevate safety in this country. So that's certainly one thing. The other thing I would be remiss without saying is funding, right? What you are looking at city budgets and seeing how things and what's being funded, thinking about comprehensive approaches, public health approaches to crime and violence, like violence interruption programs, mentoring, after school programs. So thinking about what we call in public health, those protective factors, and how do we fund those to mitigate and reduce the likelihood of violence occurring in the first place. Again, that's a part of this shared collective of safety where we all have a piece and a set of responsibilities. The other thing I want, not necessarily a part of, not directly related, but I think tangent to it, some work that I've been involved in is really re-elevating the utility of restorative justice, right? Because we know violence is very interpersonal and those interactions are very interpersonal. We worked with programs where someone is shot and then they're going back into the community where they're shot. So not directly related to policing per se, but again, it's a part of this shared safety and ensuring that police are aware of the utility of restorative justice and how communities negotiate and do problem solving internally.
Thank you.
My fellow panelists are quite learned. They have not left me a whole lot that's new to add here, so I will maybe just throw in a few amens or sort of things to emphasize. I agree with the sergeant about the need for community engagement and involvement. The only thing I would add to that is figure out how to make that a formal part of the process, right? Like the citizens advisory boards, or I'm sure there are different structures, right? People don't want to be invited just a few times and you feel like you've got it and then you go back to business as usual, right? That is not transformative. That is not really about change. That is about checking a box and moving on, right? In terms of what Mighty is saying, absolutely. Data, data, data. The first thing you have to do is just make sure that law enforcement is collecting data on their interaction with the public, regardless of what the interaction is, right? Across all of those intersections, right? Because that's how you understand who law enforcement is engaging with and who they're not connecting with, right? And then you get a situation where they can go and begin to make connections to those communities, as a regular matter of the work that they do, not just showing up in crisis and trying to build connections at that point. I think it's also important just generally to look at the budgets of the state or the locality, et cetera, where you are, because when you do that, you can get a sense of how law enforcement is being funded versus how public health and social services are being funded. Because sometimes you look at places and they are really, we've been in kind of this place since the 90s, right? This whole tough, even before it was really, okay, let's go back to Nixon, right? The war on drugs or tough on crime or whatever. And you over rely on your criminal justice response. So that means that law enforcement and your prosecutors and others are overfunded, and then your public health response is underfunded, right? You need to look at the creation of some of the systems that Mighty was pointing to, right? Maybe it's not a good idea always, or in some places ever, to have law enforcement lead in this response to domestic violence, right? If you look at it through a prevention and public health lens, then maybe you can do more in the response of people who are trained as social workers or people with a public health background who can be part at minimum of that response, right? I think there was one other thing right. You need to, in essence, you need to make sure that all of the arms of government, right? Law enforcement on the one hand, social services, public health on the other, are equally well resourced for being able to respond to the community. Because once you can do that, then you can figure out how those two bridge and work together, right? So there are situations where a law enforcement response is going to be appropriate, but perhaps you bring folks with a public health or a social work, et cetera, background with you so that you have all the tools together that can respond and you can make those choices in real time, as opposed to, we have seen these tragic situations apart from domestic violence where people are really struggling in a mental health context, right? And one of the things that has not come up in this context, which is important to flag, is the pandemic, right?
Yes.
The pandemic and the fact that people are working at home or in closer quarters has caused, an increase in friction or tension, or let me speak to this one, what it means to have your child, doing school from home for a full year, right? That changes family and relational dynamics. We haven't had to call the police though. It's all good here. But, all of those things mean that we have to actually sit consciously and figure out, how do we tailor the response to the context that we're in? Because this particular, still in the pandemic context, people struggling economically, right? That is always going to heighten, the likelihood of tensions flaring in a place where there was already tension, right? So trying to get our arms around, how do we respond in this context? How do we show up with all the resources? How do we understand that if somebody is having a mental health crisis, that people with a mental health background should probably lead that response? All of those, I think, are, key to figuring out how to move forward.
Thanks so much, Lisa Lynn.
And if I may add,
Please.
Those are some things that we already do, right, when we're responding. So we would have social workers, and we're all trained with, through CIT, in the state of Virginia, everyone had to be crisis intervention training, so that when we are meeting these crises, at least we can maintain and manage it until we get other professionals there. So that's some of the work, especially mandated by the state of Virginia, in light of mental health and social workers riding along, not just for domestic violence, but when we talk about substance abuse as well, individuals that ride with our officers to get out and to be able to be that first line of support, because we know everyone does not want to talk to the police. And if you're in crisis, you need somebody that has the ability to provide a listening ear. The uniform within itself is just, this barrier, and we understand that. And so being able to have the opportunity to have partners come on to be able to get out and to respond to calls for service with us like that. And as Mighty talked about before, and I talked about the one-stop shop, the 911 call comes in. And so in public safety, we've had to decide how to build our partners and how to create the dynamics where we can respond together, right? Or even if we don't respond together, we have the next steps in place so that we have someone else to come along and to be able to provide that assistance that's very much needed. And then to be able to direct them to the resources that are readily available. But, I can say over the 24 years since 1997 coming on, we have turned this corner. We are doing so many different things when we talk about public safety and policing, because every call is not about a crime. And our goal is to protect and to serve and to make sure that everyone is healthy and everyone is safe. And, through all of the ups and the downs, we still have to get out and we have to respond to those calls. And whether individuals care for the police or not, they're going to call 911 when they need help. And we have to be prepared to respond and to provide wholehearted services and to make sure that everybody is safe.
Folks, thank you. If you are just now joining, please feel free to drop any questions in our Q&A box. We have Ms. Lisa Lynn Jacobs here providing our domestic violence and sexual assault perspective. Mr. Mighty Fine will be providing perspective as it relates to public health. And Sergeant Carol Adams is here providing a law enforcement perspective to our panel entitled To Serve and Protect Black Women, Expanding an Understanding of Safety as it relates to Status Quo Shifts, which is the first part of a series. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. Let us know where you're from and where you work, like Miss Bernita Walker has already done. We are going to wrap promptly at 3:30, just to share that with you, but we certainly want to get as many questions in as possible before we do wrap. Which police reform ideology seemingly promotes the highest levels of safety for Black women? And that's an open question to the three of you.
I need to make sure I understand the question.
And just to provide a little bit of perspective, at the top of the hour, when we talked a little bit about ideologies, We named them as Defund, Abolish, Reform, and Dismantle. So in your, if you could share your thoughts on which police reform ideology seemingly promotes the highest level of safety for Black women survivors.
Okay. You know, there's great danger in asking that question to somebody who works inside the Beltway, right? Because no, I mean, it's just, there's a reality, right? There is a pure answer to that question. But I think those answers for me are just tempered by where I do the work, right? Which is the federal space, right? So the answers in that space, and I've said this before, right? They're somewhat cabined by the perspective that the president has, right? Which is reform minded, right? That does not necessarily get squarely to the question that we have before us about the safety of Black women, right? And I think the answers there are somewhat closer at minimum to reimagine, right? Than reform, right? Reform, I think, looks at changes, but ones that are much closer to our current system, right? As opposed to reimagine, which looks at those systems and figures out really as a systemic matter what we need to do and what we might need to add and subtract in order to get ourselves in the right place or moving in the right direction, right? I think that there is, and we've been talking about this, we just haven't talked about this piece, right? Black women are at greatest, or certainly among those at greatest risk for domestic violence, homicide, right? So that then means that we need a much stronger prevention lens on the work, right? Because at the point where law enforcement is pulled into a situation like that, right, they are trying to intervene at what may very well be the 11th hour, right? So trying to figure out, and I know you wanted to sort of talk about these particular structures, right? Ensuring that in the reimagine context or defund or whichever one that we are looking at, that we are focused heavily on a context of intervention and understanding what the stressors are for Black women's intimate partners that is causing complexity, right? I talked a little bit about being in the pandemic. Economic stressors are actually implicated in the homicides of Black women, right? So I'm saying this, what I'm doing here is name checking what it is that each of these entities, whether or not it's reform or defund or reimagine, needs to be looking at in that context. So those are my threshold thoughts. Colleagues?
Thank you.
I'll just add, I totally concur with you on the prevention end of things, certainly thinking about it from that perspective. Taking it from an ideological vantage point, I would say it would be, I'm not sure if this is answering the question, but borrowing from Dr. Kamara Jones when she talks about blockages to reaching or achieving health equity. So obviously, I think this needs to have a health equity lens, whatever we do, right? So I link that to sort of white supremacist ideologies that we're operating in. We may have talked about racism and called it out by name, I'm not sure. So to me, any sort of reimagining of that has to outwardly and name racism and white supremacist culture as a major factor in how we value the lives of Black women in this country. Again, whether we're talking about policing or otherwise. So again, not sure if that's answering your question, but to me, we have to uplift and uphold that and recognize that that is a thread in the fabric of this country that we need to pull out intentionally and ensure that lives are valued equally, particularly for Black women.
Thank you.
And I agree with both panelists, but what Lisa said about reimagining in Mighty, it has to be a new system. So that means that we're creating a new set of rules of engagement, new vision, new protocols, new operating procedures, as well as going upstream. You know, we have to do prevention and intervention parallelly. We have to intervene to be able to help those who are heavily involved or being impacted by domestic violence. But we got to reach out to middle school students, middle school young girls, and start with those programs and start to do that work so that we can help them understand their value and their worth. Those are things that we have to teach, and we have to have individuals that can work with them so that as they move through. I haven't talked about, but I have a nonprofit, the Carol Adams Foundation, and intervention and prevention is the key. Yes, I'm here to provide emergency shelter, housing, clothing, and all of those things for my adults, men and women who have been impacted by domestic violence. But my focus is those young people. You know, they're living in these situations. And so I can't change the world that they're living in, but I can create a parallel world, and I can help them identify and have some understanding of their value and their worth. Because as a young person, as a 17-year-old whose mom was shot 5 times and she was in the next room and living through 12 years of escalating violence, and to see my mom leave and to go back, and for me to plead with her, and then for me to be upset with both of them because I don't like either one of them at this point, because she continues to go back and he won't change his behavior. So the community invested in me. I had a grandmother that, you know, was always there for me. So these are the things that the programs that we have to put in place, and to have people in place to be beacons of light and to share that hope, and to let them know it doesn't matter where you come from, it's where you decide to go. And there will be support systems in places to help you navigate to your next steps or to the rest of your life. So it's the reimagining and to help them understand their value, because if you don't know your value and your worth, then that means that people can do anything with you, and they can come in and out of your lives, and then you don't have a clear understanding, and you're spending your entire life trying to figure out who you are and how do you identify. And we all know that some children identify with one side of the spectrum or the other side of the spectrum. So we have to put things in place so that we can help them have a clear understanding of a value system in their worth and what the things that they can do, and to help them navigate and to provide those resources and those opportunities of exposure and experience so that they won't succumb to the options that are on the table, the negative options that are left on the table.
Yeah, just to pick up again what you're putting down, I think it's really important to appreciate, as you've elevated those buffers, whether they're grandparents, teachers, and mentors. Those are critically important, particularly among young folks who are witnessing violence in some manner. And it's one of the things that I always like to promote too. It's certainly we're working for situations to be free of violence, and we need to also acknowledge that we need to have the presence of opportunity. So it's not just the absence of violence and all of that comes with that. It's also the presence of opportunity. And to your point, ensuring that young folks are feeling valued, women are feeling valued, and recognizing that we're providing resources, tools, et cetera, that are necessary for them to reach self-actualization and to live life to their greatest potential.
Thank you. We have a question from one of the audience members. Why do you feel that Black women are the highest racial group for domestic violence?
How long do you have?
We are exactly at 3:19. This is likely going to be our last question.
Excellent. Excellent. I think you need to look at a few things when you look to answer that question, right? Chief among them, Black women being the antithesis of the power structure in this country, right? We are neither white nor male, right? We were also brought to this country enslaved, right? And were not only treated as chattel in that respect, but also victimized from day one with respect to sexual assault, right? And basically, our job was partially to breed more slaves, right? So in that context, right, when you understand that that viewpoint of who a Black woman is and what her purposes are, that is woven into the fabric of our country, right? That is misogynoir, right? That is bias against someone both because of her sex and her race, right? When you understand that that is woven into the fabric of this country, that gives you the basis from which to then understand how it can show up in the context of intimate partner violence, right? Also woven into the fabric of this country, right, is not only violence against Black men and treatment of them as enslaved persons, right? But that sits alongside a system that espouses the American dream, right? You are supposed to succeed in a particular, series of, doing well academically, succeeding economically, getting a house in the suburbs or whatever else. That is supposed to be an aspiration for us all, but that is not a pathway that is available to us all, right? That is also not the viewpoint that society has for us all. When you look at the extent to which Black men and Black women are heavily over incarcerated in this country, right? So if you have this American dream on the one hand, and you deny to Black people many of the tools for achieving it, right? That creates this situation where there is a lot of frustration and anger, etc. And you often take that anger out on those closest to you, right? We understand, as I was alluding to before, right, that many of the, the causes of intimate partner violence can be traced back to conflict over economic issues. You ask couples what they fight about money, right? People who may have incarceration as a feature playing in their background, even if they are re-entering, have limited economic prospects, right? And also have a sense of identity which is fragile, right? In this place where we're all taught that we are supposed to be accomplished, right? So if you have someone who may have grown up in a situation of toxic masculinity, which is something else we need to work with, who has fragility around what their identity is and what masculinity is in terms of you're supposed to provide for your family, right? If you find in the midst of all of that conflict arises, which it may, because of scarce resources, right? And your intimate partner then says on top of all of this that she is done or she is leaving you, that is a very, that is a situation of combustion, right? That is a moment where you can, for all the reasons that I have just shared, see a lashing out, which depending on context, right? We know that there are other indicia for lethality, right? Having a weapon, right? Committing sexual violence, right? But immediately beneath those two, having a weapon, committing sexual violence, abuse of animals, immediately beneath those three are the unemployment of the abusive person, right? So that just speaks, that's the answer to the question, but it also speaks to the need for us to improve economic prospects in our community and equip people with skills that they have not only to better support their families, but it will also go to, helping folks to a situation where they feel accomplished, right? Where they feel that they can achieve the goals and the expectation that society, however misogynist and problematic, that they can achieve those goals within the parameters that they are offered to us all or imposed on us all.
Well, it goes back to the reporting as well, but access to resources, because, there are in support, family support, because when we look at Black families and Black women, if everybody is going through the same journey, the same struggle, right? So And then if you have children involved, so where are you going to go? So it's a continuous cycle. So when you step out, you know, the family might keep you for a couple of days, but then you're gonna have to go right back. But when we look at the reporting and we look at the overall resources, whereas European families, they have the family wealth, they have the family support, the community support, you know, and so in their circle of network, right? Their networking circle. So it will be happening in their communities and they don't have to report because they have the family money to be able to walk away or to put themselves up or to move across country and to do these things to take, you know, so it's all about accessibility and resources and the scarcity of resources as well. And then it becomes this image. And as I talked about the youth before, the kids before, if you're living in a household and it's continuing to happen and it's a cycle, so you begin to believe that this is the way that a relationship is supposed to be. So that's where ours become more, when we talk about compressing households, compressing neighborhoods and communities, and this is a cycle. So the cycle of violence, the cycle of domestics, the cycle of drug abuse. So all of these things are co-occurring and reoccurring in our communities and within our households.
Thank you so much. Folks, I just want to get some final words from you all on your perspectives. Whoever wants to go first, feel free to chime in. Feel free to also share your websites and where folks can follow your research and things, writings and things that you're putting out there so they can, you know, learn more from your perspective.
I'll just quickly say again, thanks for the opportunity to be here and share space with everyone. As we know, this is a very complex issue and we don't always have all the answers, but I think us posing the questions and working through them like we've done in this space stimulates sort of our collective consciousness to think about what can be done to engender a sense of shared safety where we all have a role and recognize the importance and above all, recognize how Black lives are mistreated and figure out ways or uplift the ways that we know are working to ensure that we are treated as we should be as humans, et cetera. So again, I just think it's important to have these conversations, even when the questions are challenging and we don't always have immediate solutions.
Thanks so much. Lisa Lynn?
Thanks for having me, right? This has been a rich conversation. I love the conversations where I am sharing but learning simultaneously. I think that we are in a rare historical moment, right? To have an administration that really is trying to be responsive in that space of equity, right? Looking at issues around health equity, whether it's maternal mortality on the one hand of Black women or the higher incidence of domestic violence homicides, right? I think that trying to seize this moment, and to the extent that at the federal level, we have a Congress that maybe you can occasionally to induce to go in a positive, somewhat not regressive, I'm not ready to say progressive today, direction is a piece of that, right? But I am hopeful because of the conversations and the way in which communities and individuals have started to show up in the wake of George Floyd's homicide, right? I heard a piece on the news yesterday about a white woman in Massachusetts who sent a Black man to jail decades ago for sexual assault. But when she saw what had gone on in the George Floyd context and began to understand for herself how much, the greater incidence of criminalization, the tendency to criminalize Black people and Black men, she acknowledged that she could have incorrectly identified him, right? And so she's going to court later this week to tell that to the court when this man is showing up for the, I'm not quite sure what number time for a parole hearing. And so even at the individual level, I am hopeful that we can begin to make some structural and individual change to bring the kinds of improvement in this society that we all need.
Thanks so much. And Sergeant Adams, feel free to share any of your contact information as well as other work that you're doing out in the community as well.
Well, I'm just thankful for being able to be a part of this conversation. And as I shared, you know, my journey, my life's journey, and for God to be able to put me in a place for not just my voice, but my mother's voice to be heard. And here in Virginia, I could say my dad shot her 5 times while laying in the bed next to her, and he openly threatened to kill her multiple times. And his sentencing was 7 years with 5 years suspended. So she didn't have a voice. And so I know that that's why I do this work, and that's why I'm here wearing this uniform, because you have to become a part of a process to change a process. And it's difficult some days, but it's well worth it. And when I look back at Bawa, you know, that's 1994. And back in 1980, when my mother was murdered, you know, there was no documenting or tracking domestic assaults. So when my dad went to court, you know, they just saw him as a man that had been working because he had not committed a criminal offense, you know, according to police records and files. And so to see where we have come and to be able to participate and to be a voice for the voiceless and for those women, you know, back in the 60s, and, you know, they were told, you know, well, we were told, you, whatever happens in the house stays in the house. And we really, as a Black community, has to change that fact, because that is something that still occurs to this day. And in order for our families to become healthy and to get the help that they really need, we have to talk about it. And we cannot allow our children to continue to suppress these incidents and this trauma that is happening to them, or, you know, in so many, you know, it's such a struggle to get out of the house, to get from the house to the school. So you're traumatized inside the house, traumatized in the community, and then you go to school, and then you're expected to learn and to be able to process, right, and to keep up. So there's so many different dynamics that we have to really, really address and bring to the forefront. You know, like, it is not as if our children can't learn or they are the first ones to get put out of schools. Like, but, you know, it took, you know, so much for them to get up and to get there. So I'm always excited to be a part of a conversation and to share, you know, my family's history, because I think sometimes people see you on a platform and they don't know that you've had an experience, a life experience. It's like life happens to all of us. And so we have to make sure that we, you know, get that information out there. So just thank you for reaching out to me, and Dwayne Crawford always for getting me in places so that, you know, I can share from my lived and learned perspective, you know, and not just from the uniform. And Lisa has been in a couple of meetings with me, and I had to tell them that, you know, you're asking Sergeant Adams, but I have to tell you about Carol Adams, because there's no separating me. So you have to understand from what perspective I represent here. You know, I can talk about public safety and all of that, but what's deep in my heart and what has been my life was tried and true that I know, you know, and knowing that, you know, there was no justice. Not that going to prison a long time would have been justice for my father, but still my mother's life was not valued, because we have people in prison who are doing a lot of long-term sentences who have done a lot less. So just thank you all. And thank you, Mighty Fine and Lisa Lynn and Lisa, for all of your work. And it's always an honor to be able to sit on a panel and to be, you know, in your presence. And thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists with all their insight and wealth of information. We certainly do appreciate the wisdom and information you shared with us. Folks, they have all dropped their contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out to them directly should you have additional questions. Always check back with ujimacommunity.org to check out what we're doing and to see what new programs and things that Ujima is doing. Just wanted to share, I have direct messaged several of you, but there is going to be a recording sent out. So in the event that you have missed some of the presentation, you will have the opportunity to review it. That said, please make sure that you sign up for our presentation, part 2 of this series next week. And again, thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate it. Have a good day.